So today's program.
Oh,
Just let.
there we go. All right. So Matthew Marshall is the executive director of the Redwood Coast Energy Authority, which many of you are aware of, and he's come and spoken before. And last night I said, oh, hey, Matthew, you want to send me a couple sentences, or do you want me just to wing it? He says, oh, go ahead and just wing it. So I'm going to wing it. What if I told you there was an odorless, tasteless, smellless gas out there that could provide you with power? Air, yes, exactly, if properly manipulated. So, so Matthew is the executive director of RCEA, and I had the pleasure of participating on a review committee looking at proposals for the development of offshore wind energy. I don't know why I was put on the committee, because I know what wind is, and I know what the offshore means, but I had no knowledge beyond that. It was fascinating to read through these proposals and what's going on, and so that project is moving forward, and I thought it'd be really cool to have Matthew come and update us on that. So Matthew, come on up. I won't go into your biography because I'm just make up stuff. We've had some shenanigans in our past, so we'll just leave it at that.
Matthew. Thanks for having me, and you heard what I'm going to talk about. Yeah. So if you're not familiar with the Redwood Coast Energy Authority, we're a joint powers agency of the county of Humboldt, all the cities in Humboldt County, as well as the Humboldt Bay Municipal Water District. And we've been around since 2003, doing energy efficiency programs, renewable energy programs, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, things like that. And so one of the new endeavors that we're working on is the offshore wind potential here in Humboldt County. So if you look at a map, this map is of the wind energy generation potential for the entire country. And if there's a little scale on the bottom, that, you know, the best is blue, red second best, and purple, yellow. And so if you look at that map, you know, where there's the biggest blue splotch in the entire country is offshore of the North Coast. And so we have basically the best wind resource potential of anywhere in the country. Now, it's offshore, and it's offshore the West Coast, which adds sort of two complications. One, there's not a lot of offshore in the United States as far as offshore wind. It's pretty common now in Europe and other parts of the world, but it's just getting going on the East Coast. There's the first project on the East Coast went in, it was operational last year. There's others in the queue, so it's starting to take off on the East Coast. But on the West Coast, the challenges are water gets pretty deep pretty quickly, and so the typical offshore wind farms you see are just fixed bottoms, so they're attached to the seafloor. But in our area, to be able to do it, it would have to actually be like a floating platform technology, and that technology is just kind of reaching prime time and becoming commercially available. And so that's where there's increasing interest in the West Coast for offshore wind. And so because that technology is really now being commercially deployed in Europe and has been sort of proven out through testing and research efforts, both the federal and state government are interested in the coast of California as a potential area for wind development. But the Department of Defense made this map. Everyone thought the first projects were going to be down where there's population centers and you know, lots of grid infrastructure. And then the Department of Defense said, you know, we think these red areas are not so compatible because we're doing testing, we're doing training, and there's a lot of that going on in the central and southern coasts of California. And so the only area they left kind of green in their initial map was the North Coast. And so that started getting us a lot more interest from industry, you know, and as well as state and federal officials saying, oh, okay, well, if this is where the Department of Defense feels like there's the least conflict, maybe this is where we should be looking first. So people kind of all sort of started looking up this way instead of down south. I think the Department of Defense is going to ease up a little bit down south and not just redline everything, you know, from San Francisco and beyond. But this certainly kind of catalyzed some near-term interest, overlapping obviously with the fact that we do have the best resource up here, but we don't have this transmission infrastructure or big population base to use a lot of energy. So, you know, the scale of what might happen up here, at least initially, has to be a lot smaller than it would be elsewhere. So as far as like what does a floating wind turbine actually look like, there's different types of platform technology that people are developing, but it's not science fiction. These things are actually happening in the world now. So there's the kind of the left, the first full-scale commercial project went in off of Scotland, and it's using kind of a similar technology on the left. There's these other kinds of platforms, and the one we're looking at is basically the one in the middle, because that's best suited to be able to be deployed in our area. The sort of one on the left is the other one that's the farthest along, but it kind of takes certain crane vessels, and the deployment of that works in Europe where they have the right conditions and the right equipment, but on the West Coast that would be a lot trickier, and Humboldt Bay wouldn't really be well suited to that, so we're really focusing on that middle technology. And here's what it looks like in the real world. That's an actual photograph from Portugal of one of the first pilots that was tested for, I think 5 or so years. It went through the full life cycle of being deployed, being operated, surviving 60-foot waves, and then being decommissioned and taken back out to kind of prove out that whole life cycle. And so this is the company that makes that platform in this picture is the one that we're working with. And this was their first project in Portugal that this picture is from. They're deploying, they've got 3 more projects in the queue right now in France, Portugal, and Scotland that are going in, starting this year actually, for 2 of those. So it's in Europe, again, it's being implemented at scale, and they're looking to now look at the US market. So the companies that we were working with, and as Greg mentioned, we issued this request for qualifications for development partners because we wanted to have a process that was more locally driven and not just saying, well, let's let all these big European companies duke it out and see which one wants to do a project here, and hopefully they'll do it in a way that is considerate of local fishing interests and environment. And so we wanted to be a little more proactive in that, since that's something we've really heard from the community is folks want projects to be developed in a way that kind of aligns with our community values and needs and what we want to see. And so we said, hey, who wants to actually have this be more of a true partnership with the local community? We got 5 developers responded that all are multi-billion-dollar companies from Europe. I mean, we had one from Portugal that is EDP Renewables that we ended up selecting along with other team members. There was one from France, Germany, Denmark, Norway. So the companies that are doing offshore wind are typically European companies, and these are all companies that are doing this in the world and have hundreds of these turbines operating and have tens of billions of dollars in the bank. So the interest in this is quite real, and I would say these European companies are pretty bullish about the US market for offshore wind. And so the companies that we are working with, though, EDP Renewables is a large wind and energy development company based in Portugal, but they have projects all over the world, in the US and California. I visited one of the wind farms before we knew that we were going to be working with them in Indiana. The other 2 companies, Principal Power is actually based in the Bay Area in Emeryville, but all their work has been in Europe, and they're the company that does basically the yellow part in this picture. They're the platform design company, and that's really adapted from oil and gas industry technology to scale down for a wind turbine. So it's kind of taking something that's proven and existing and adjusting it to this context. And then Aker Solutions is a Norwegian-based company that works all over the world. I think they're like 110 years old, and they build crazy stuff in the ocean. So undersea cables, offshore oil platforms, those kinds of structures. And so they're well qualified to actually do this kind of work and successfully pull it off. Because it's not it's no small feat to build a 600-foot floating turbine out in the ocean and have it function properly. And then as far as on the kind of environmental consulting side, H.T. Harvey & Associates is a local firm that was part of the team that we selected, as well as our environmental consultants from up north, and they've got a lot of experience with the offshore renewable energy permitting process that we'll have to go through. So one of the things that's most exciting about this is the renewable energy piece of it is a cool part of it, but the potential for Humboldt Bay is pretty exciting in that the harbor here has a lot of the right characteristics to actually be a hub for this kind of development. Initially that would start out with assembly and maybe fabrication of the platforms and maintenance and then those kinds of operations. But if you're looking kind of maybe down the road, long term, if a market develops on the West Coast that we could really be a hub for that kind of development. It's something that's happened for harbors in Europe, similar to ours, where maybe they're a little underutilized, you might say, and that creates an opportunity for companies to come in and use it as a staging location for not just projects off of our coast, but for the rest of California or north or anywhere kind of in the Pacific. And there's been a number of studies that like the federal government has done looking at like what harbors on the West Coast really are well suited to this. And other than the fact that we need some dock upgrades, Humboldt Bay kind of checks all the boxes. One of the key ones is vertical draft. So the way these are put together is you typically have the platform, and then you'd assemble the wind turbine on the platform and then tugboat it out, fully assembled, and ballast it once you get in place and hook it up to the mooring lines and the cable. These things are pretty gigantic. They're like 600 feet tall, so you can't fit one under the Golden Gate Bridge. So doing it anywhere in Oakland or San Francisco is a non-starter. And so the fact that we don't have a bridge between where the docking would be and being able to take things in and out of the harbor is a key feature that we have that many other harbors don't have. So I think that's one of the areas, and this doesn't take a railroad. These parts are very large, and so they're coming and going by sea, and so there isn't a constraint as far as needing that capacity to be able to do this locally. So it's something that could happen, in the next few years, as we go through this process, hopefully, and then build on that as things progress on the West Coast. So this is an example of kind of these components all come in by barge, and you'll have these kinds of staging areas where you do the assembly. Down the road, if there's really a big industry, you could have some of that manufacturing done locally. But if we're talking about a project of like maybe 10, 15 turbines, and so you're not going to manufacture those just for 10 units locally. So you'd be bringing in components and then doing the assembly locally, potentially the fabrication of the platforms locally. So where we're at, we're just in the stages of finalizing a public-private partnership agreement to get things going with those development partners. We're going to be submitting an offshore lease application, which is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is the federal agency that leases federal waters. And so we'll be submitting a lease request through the process they have to hopefully get a site off of Humboldt. And we're looking at a site that's about 24, 25 to 30 miles off the coast of Eureka, so pretty far out. As far as like visual impacts, if you go to Trinidad Head and you look at like the Samoa pulp mill smokestack, that's about 20 so miles from Trinidad Head, and that's like 300 feet tall. So if you can't see it on most days because it's pretty far away, but that would give you a sense of kind of like put that smokestack that far from Trinidad Head out into the ocean. So it'll be pretty far out, and that also helps reduce impacts to commercial fishing and wildlife, which are probably the two main factors that we're really working to work with local fishermen as well as work with environmental groups as we move through this process to try to make sure that we minimize and mitigate impacts on those fronts. We're figuring out the grid interconnection of how to get the power into the broader California grid, and how to intertie that. That's a couple-year process. As far as getting to shore, it'd basically be a buried undersea cable that would come in and then come ashore and connect to the broader grid from the project. And then we're going to be working on a port infrastructure assessment to figure out what level of upgrades do we need, how do we want to pay for those to move this forward. So that's kind of a quick overview of where we're at, and we're in the very early stages of this process. It's probably at least if everything goes as quickly as possible, it'll be a 6-year or so working through the lease application, the interconnection study, all the technical work, all the environmental review. There's about 4 or 5 steps of if you get the lease, that's not permission to build it. That's like then you submit a plan for how you're going to study it, and then if you get that plan approved, then you can do the studies, and then once the studies are complete, then you do a construction operation plan that needs to be approved. And so there's quite a lot of steps, and then it's going from federal waters onto state waters onto the shore. So it's like every single possible permitting agency that exists has to approve this. So we'll be at that for a while. But so far we've been getting a lot of positive responses from state agencies and federal agencies and local community groups. So we're optimistic that we'll be able to kind of grind through this whole process and move things forward.
So when I think of Southern California, my family's in Palm Springs, there's a huge forest of them, of these turbines. How many would you envision being out there?
Yeah, so when you're thinking of like, you know, when you see them on shore, the difference is the offshore turbines are dramatically larger because they don't have the constraints. And so even onshore, like the early generations where you see like Altamont Pass, where there's all these like little fast spinning ones, and there's like, you know, hundreds of them, that those are, you know, been slowly but surely replaced by bigger turbines, so bigger, fewer turbines basically that are farther apart. And there's, you know, efficiency gains from that as far as the larger turbines are more, they produce more energy per unit cost, and then also they're not quite as visually overwhelming because you've got, you know, instead of like 10 little ones, you've got, you know, one big one that's just sitting there. And so these ones that are offshore, because there isn't those constraints of trying to have things that can fit on a truck or fit on a rail car, they're typically much larger. Like, you know, I said they can be, the modern turbines are like starting to be like 10 megawatts, which a typical like modern onshore turbine is like 1 megawatt. So they're larger, and so we're talking about like maybe 10, 12 turbines that would be out 20, 30 miles off the coast. So not like a forest of these things, but like I said, they're very tall. They're like the height of like the Golden Gate Bridge size, you know. So you've got a few of these big structures that are out there instead of those big kind of clusters of small ones.
How far apart? So what's the footprint?
They're about a mile apart is usually kind of, you know, it has to do with how, you know, like their rotor diameter to not have like basically the turbulence from one impacting the other. So you'd have like a row of 10 of these about a mile apart.
Are they bidirectional or?
Yeah, so they'll adjust to, you know, depending on what direction the wind's going. Yeah.
So the cable is going to be in the ground. I mean, it's
yeah. So the cable would, you know, there'd be a cable connecting them out there at the farm, and then it would go down to the seafloor and then be buried and go across the seafloor to shore.
So there's potential of 10 cables.
No, it'd be one cable coming in. Yeah. So they would group together to like an offshore substation, and then one cable would come onshore.
But you're still going to have those subsequent ones to meet up there.
Yeah, so let's say you've got them in a row of 10, there would be a cable that would go between them, and then that would go to shore.
Right.
So they'd be connected to each. It wouldn't be necessarily
not...
it wouldn't be like a hub and spoke. It would be like a daisy chain of them then going to shore.
If you're an energy authority, I assume you look at all the energy possibilities. Quite a while ago, they were talking about the wave or tide generated ones to go up and down.
Yeah.
Because one thing we got out there, I'm a fisherman, we got a lot of swells. Every 4 seconds today.
And so the wave and wind generation potential are, you know, it's not a coincidence that we have both. Obviously, you know, they're related. There's definitely the possibility of wave energy generation. The technology for wave generation is still in kind of the early R&D stages, whereas offshore wind is commercially happening. You know, I mean, there's you know, hundreds of these turbines in Europe, and so, you know, that's where, not that there isn't that wave potential, but right now there's still just, you know, a few projects that have one device that they're trying to get, you know, tested and developed, as opposed to it being, you know, something that can actually be, you know, commercially deployed. Yeah.
What's the current thinking about the impact of the bird populations and the fact that they're way out in the ocean? Would that reduce that impact?
Yeah, so yeah, I'm not a biologist, but the folks we've talked to have generally said, you know, the farther out you go, the fewer species, you know, the less impacts you're going to have. But it's not that there's no birds out there, and it is also a little more challenging to study what the impacts are when you're that far out. You know, it's not like something on shore where you can just have a, you know, grad student hang out underneath it and, you know, walk around and see if there's any dead birds and, you know, and sit there with binoculars. So, you know, there's actually H.C. Harvey and Associates, one of their, you know, big areas of focus is what's the technology necessary to assess the impacts of these kinds of projects, and, you know, and so, you know, luckily we're not the first to be doing this, so there's a lot of work that's, you know, going on, but I will say that's, you know, that's one of the areas, you know, that's a key concern is, okay, we've got to make sure that we're doing it in a way that's minimizing impacts, both to birds as well as marine mammals, although, you know, the cables for these things are like this big, so that, like, you know, the anchor cables aren't like an entanglement risk for a whale, although you could have fishing gear that got caught on a cable and then the whale could get entangled in that, and so, you know, having systems in place to mitigate that is important. Yeah.
A couple related questions. Obviously, you've got to get the energy to where it's needed, right? So is there any talk of local storage, battery or other, and also in terms of transmission out of the area, are you also looking at the other projects that are happening, like the Scotia Bridgeville tie-in and things like that?
Yeah, so definitely, and and that's one of the reasons, so the scale that we're looking at would, be the target is to not need to like upgrade the transmission lines all the way to the central, valley. If there's, and that's where the study process kind of looks at, what are other projects, what are the interactions of those, how does that impact, how much power can go on the grid locally, and so there's like a 2-year state process that we'll go through that'll say, okay, this is how much you can actually put on the grid, what are the constraints to that. Storage is becoming one option to help, integrate, more renewable energy generation, so that if, it's not synced up to quite the right time, you can adjust that with battery storage. We're actually looking at that for the project we're doing up at the airport. And Coast Guard Station is putting in a large Tesla battery system with solar that will be able to do that sort of triage of balancing the grid needs and wholesale power prices to what the output of the solar array is, and then that project will have the added benefit of, if the grid goes down, we'll be able to power the Coast Guard and the airport off of solar and battery pretty much indefinitely. So it'll add some emergency response resiliency capabilities and redundant backup out there at the airport. So, yeah.
How much would the wind power generated cost as compared to the energy that we currently get? And then with the supply of energy like that, does that open up any kind of new economic markets here locally outside of the manufacturing and installation of
yeah, so the first project probably won't be like the cheapest, electricity on the market right off the bat. So one of the things that, that's a question that's crucial, because like, okay, if the prices can't get competitive, then it's gonna, it's not gonna take off. Now, I will say in Europe, and actually, in Europe, the prices have been coming down where they're starting to have, basically unsubsidized offshore wind projects that can just compete on the open market with other resources. And then back east, they just got a big project that was awarded in Massachusetts, and the price that came in at was like below other renewable prices on the East Coast, and it was like way below what people thought was going to be the bid price that would actually be the winning bid for that project, and so the prices are coming down, and so we'll see where this one falls as the first round, but certainly as far as the sort of economic potential of it, our involvement in this, we're expecting to be a power off-taker, but we're not thinking we're necessarily going to be the only person buying power from the project. So there is potential for that to be kind of, a market opportunity, if you will. Yeah.
What are the conditions on the permit? Just basically as far as access and also what sort of impact does it have on the marine life situation? I would imagine there's a lot of life around those.
Yeah, so in some cases they'll, there's positive impacts in that, they can be an artificial reef. Now this far out, I think that'll be less of a factor, but like the project in Rhode Island that went in, like there's a lot of sport fishing because they've created a reef structure that, grows barnacles and mussels that fish like that, and so, they actually take, fishing trips out to that project now because it's an artificial reef. But the BOEM process basically is, the federal agency that like leases it, and then you go through the permitting processes with all the agencies that have to approve that. It is, I will say, just a lease for offshore wind. It's not like you can piggyback offshore oil or anything onto that, because BOEM is also the one that does leasing for offshore oil and gas, but there are different processes, and it's not like you can combine the two into one lease application, so they're mutually exclusive processes. As far as the wildlife impacts, I think, seabirds is probably the key one, and then, whales would be the other. There's benefits of doing floating projects compared to the fixed bottom one, because one of the impacts to whales is when they're putting these in and they're driving these piles for these projects, that can be, acoustically disruptive, whereas this is just an anchoring system. It's also easier to take out, so after a 25-year, let's say, life cycle of the project, unlike having something that you've attached to the seafloor, which is a lot harder to get out, this just has anchor cables that you can pull up and you can tugboat the whole thing in, and you know, this picture is actually from them decommissioning it. So that was one of the things they wanted to prove with that first Portugal project, was that, oh, you can put this in, you can operate it, you can also take it out easily, you know, and it's easy to decommission it for, you know, after the life of the project. And so they operated it for about 5 years, and this is when they're taking it apart. Now they wet stored that platform, so they sunk it off the coast of Portugal to store it, you know, just to get it out of the way. And then for their Scottish project, they actually brought it back up, scraped it off, and then they sent it to Scotland, and I think it actually is up and running in Scotland now. So they're pretty durable in that sense as far as the platform itself. I mean, they obviously detached the turbine and took that apart, but then the platform they sunk and stored underwater.
So what's the typical lifespan then of one of these?
Yeah, so it's like 25 years is usually like the lifespan of a project, you know, for wind projects, you know. So after that 25-year period, it would either be, you know, taken out, decommissioned, or you might repower it and, you know, put new turbines, renew the lease or something if it was, you know, if that made sense at the time.
How long has this been on your drawing board locally, and how has enthusiasm at the federal level changed?
Yeah, so, you know, it's been in kind of our long-term planning efforts. It was like, hey, we've got this great offshore wind, you know, resource as well as wave energy generation potential, and it was sort of like, but the technology's not really there. It's still kind of in the R&D stage, and so it's really, you know, the last couple years is when, you know, it started to say, okay, it's going out of the R&D stage in Europe into the actual commercial stage. When, you know, we said, oh, we should take another look at that. So about 2 years ago, we actually said, you know, we should start investigating seriously the potential to do this. And then that really picked up as, you know, the federal government started realizing that this was, you know, something that was a real potential. And I would say the industry realized it before, like the state of California and even the federal government, and that there was an unsolicited lease request down off of Morro Bay. And, you know, and I think the state and the federal government started saying, oh wait, companies actually are ready to start doing this, and we're kind of behind the game, and so they're kind of scrambling to get their, you know, ducks in a row. Conversely, on the East Coast, it's, you know, it's really kind of taken off, and you know, it's well underway to kind of start catching up with Europe in that regard. So we've been at it for a couple years, and I think we're seeing, you know, in the last year and a half, the state and federal governments sort of say, oh, okay, this is something that really is going to happen. You know, so we've had folks from BOEM and the state come up here several times now, and you know, meet with us, meet with local fishermen, you know, to start kind of realizing that this is a potential.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.